Hey everyone, and welcome back to Cow Talks. I am Marcelo Valau, Forage Extension Specialist with the University of Florida and an agricultural producer myself. On this podcast, we explore the many facets of agricultural production systems to discuss the technical aspects and decision-making processes that shape the competitiveness and long-term sustainability of our farms and ranches. Join me in these conversations where I explore the minds of different professionals to bring multiple perspectives to the challenges and opportunities facing modern agriculture.
Hey there, it's Olivia Mull. I'm the producer for Cow Talks. As part of the Forage Extension team, our number one goal is to make sure our listeners are learning from and applying the knowledge we bring on this podcast. We want to hear more about how you are using this information and get your feedback on current and future topics. That's why we have created a quick survey to hear from you and make this podcast even more relevant to your needs. The link is in the description. Please take 2 minutes to leave us your feedback. Thanks in advance and enjoy this episode.
Hello and welcome to Cow Talks. I'm Marcelo Valau, Forage Extension Specialist and Associate Program Leader with the University of Florida. And this is our Research in Perspective, where we bring some of the most important aspects of our research that is affecting directly the agricultural production system in the Southeast. Today, my guest is William Piwowarek, one of our former students here with the Forage team, now finishing his graduate work in entomology and moving on to the University of Arizona for his PhD. And Wilhelm has been in our Cow Talks podcast before talking about mole crickets. So for those that have not heard that or seen that episode, check it out to understand a little bit more of the history, the biology, and some of the management issues that we have with mole cricket that when we feature Wilhelm and Dr. Norm Lepla. Today, we're going to talk more about his research and what came out of that. Wilhelm, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting me today.
Fantastic. So, as I mentioned before, we talked about the biology, we talked about the history. We knew a lot about mole cricket before, but you still decided to take the task. Why did you decide to take the mole cricket route again?
Well, mole crickets really needed to be revisited because we had a lot of old research on mole crickets. But most of the mole cricket research, like the really good mole cricket research, ended in about the 80s. And there's not been a lot of work recently. There's some work from Adam Dale. He's doing some really excellent mole cricket work in entomology here and there. But otherwise, it's been largely abandoned. But producers are still reporting to us that mole crickets are an issue in their fields. And so that was really the incentive for me to do my master's project, was to revisit the system and kind of see what's going on.
Very interesting. And one of the conversations we had, Sue, when you were working with me here, was the kind of resurgence of the issues. I've been getting a lot of calls about mole crickets, and often enough, producers don't like the answers we gave, which was there is not much we can do about it. We just need to improve general pasture management. So you did your survey. That's part of your master's program to understand a little bit more of the problem. What came out of that first survey?
So the survey was I would go to people's farms. Ultimately, that was 5 farms that I was able to visit and successfully sample for mole crickets. And really, I was just looking for what are the numbers of mole crickets we're seeing, what's kind of the situation on the farms. It really ended up being preliminary work just to figure out what's happening with mole crickets today. And really what I found with that is that, on all these farms, mole crickets are there. You can either find them or their evidence. As to how much of a problem they really are for the field, it's a lot harder to tell, unfortunately. But we saw some pretty interesting things with the seasonality of the mole crickets, how you were able to sample them over the season. And really what I think came out of the research is setting up someone in the future to really investigate further and hopefully get a better handle on mole crickets as a problem.
So thinking about seasonality, what did you find out that was different from what we knew before about mole crickets?
Well, what I saw in my data really was that I would sample mole crickets with soapy water flushes in the soil, which is the best way to sample them locally when you're interested in a specific area. And what I found is that I could find them pretty easily in the summer and the early fall, but they were basically impossible to find in the late fall. And I think that was mostly due to soil moisture, but there might be other seasonal effects there. And that's a really important consideration for extension agents and other researchers in the future to know that they might just be really, really difficult to find in the fall, especially because that's the main season that producers report mole cricket damage.
Very good. I want to hang on to that sentence. That's when we mostly see the damage. But let me back up a little bit. It didn't help that one of our sampling years last year was extremely dry also, right?
Even the sampling year that I sampled which was this past year, 2025. It was very dry. We're in a historic drought in our region here, and I was sampling in north central Florida. So I had a lot of samplings messed up where I couldn't sample on the farms because you can't sample mole crickets if the soil is too dry. And so it was difficult, but we managed to get some data and see some things anyway.
Yeah, and by the way, we're still in a major drought. It's raining here today, which is a great thing, but I think it's going to take a lot more water to get us out of this historical drought that we're having in Florida today.
Absolutely.
But let's go back to that statement you made. Producers are seeing more of the damage in the fall. Why is that? Why are you seeing more of that damage in the fall?
Well, so in North Florida, mole crickets only have one generation per year. And so there's really only one species that we think is doing most of the damage, and that's the tawny mole cricket. We have a second one up in our area, the southern mole cricket, which is mostly a predator, and so we don't think it really causes any damage to fields. And so the tawny mole cricket emerges as babies in about May, and then they become really late, large immatures, and then adults later in the fall. And so the idea is that, they're in the fall you have these really big mole crickets that are eating a lot of the grasses, whereas earlier in the summer there's a lot of them, but they're really tiny, and so they're not doing as much damage.
And in the fall is when people actually see them a little better, so they perceive the damage.
Yeah, you can see the mole crickets sometimes running on the surface, or they'll end up in your pools. And also, it's been demonstrated in previous research that the damage progresses more and more over the course of the season, from the summer to the fall. Again, probably because the mole crickets are bigger and they're eating more of the grasses.
Very interesting, very interesting. What did you notice in those farms that were visiting? And I acknowledge that the sample size was somewhat limited. We're not able to do this project at the scale we would need to have a statewide significance. But as I said, this was a preliminary work. We're setting it for the next person in line. But what did you observe in those farms that caught your attention in terms of when the damage was more present?
I would say moisture is probably the biggest thing. One of my farms where there was a lot of mole crickets was very moist. There was more flatwoods type soil. There's a flat landscape next to kind of like a little swamp towards the east side of the pasture. And then in that pasture, the soil was wet, and I could find a lot of mole crickets until it got too dry to sample them, of course.
And this is typical for a dry year. In a wet year where those areas would be probably inundated, the flatwood soils would be saturated. Would you expect to see a lot of mole cricket damage or mole cricket presence?
I would expect to see it unless the field got flooded. The flooding will kill the mole crickets, but mole crickets like very moist soils. How far they can tolerate the moisture, we're not sure. But if it gets too moist, what I've at least been reported to me from extension agents and producers is that mole crickets will move to slightly drier areas of pasture, and then producers will see these patches in those dry areas that the mole crickets are damaging.
Yes, that's a lot of what we see there is in the patches in the pasture, especially, again, on the flatwood soils. What is thinking about some other characteristics, have you seen any effect of management directly affecting, or general grazing management or anything affecting mole cricket, or sample size was just not big enough to do that?
It's hard to say. What was interesting to me is I don't really see a relationship with overgrazing for a lot of the producers, which was an idea we had, is that overgrazing might contribute to mole crickets then becoming further of an issue. But I didn't really see that in my pastures where I would find mole crickets, at least large amounts of mole crickets. But again, it's kind of hard to tell because I had so few producers, especially I really only had one producer that represented that really wet soil type.
Okay, so we still have a lot more to learn.
Still have a lot more to learn. I think the key thing is that you're going to have mole crickets in your pasture. Whether they're actually causing a lot of the damage you're seeing is more in question. Some of my producers, they already had a rather degraded land, probably just, there's a lot of different things going on, right? There's weed pressure, other environmental conditions. And the issue with mole crickets is it's really difficult to disentangle what's mole cricket damage and what are some of these other issues.
So as always, I think when we see a pasture that is degraded for different reasons, then it's easier to see that combination of other problems. Normally related to disease, take all or other diseases, and also then the mole cricket. I want to transition. Before transitioning, a lot of our producers, when they call about mole cricket, the question is how we can control. Anything change on that?
From my research, not really, unfortunately. Really, I think what I kind of determined needs to happen is we need to reevaluate the economic threshold for mole crickets and see, what levels are we sampling that would warrant any sort of control effort. The issue is, I didn't do any of the work on any chemical registrations or anything like that, which is what a lot of producers want for mole crickets. But before we proceed with anything like that, we need to know, if you go to a pasture, you sample this amount of mole crickets, this indicates that they're doing damage, this indicates they're not doing damage. And I think I set someone up in the future to do that work, but I wasn't able to do it in just the scope of my project, unfortunately.
Well, that's how research works. We get more questions and we keep on advancing. Wilhelm, I want to transition to the second part of your work, which was also very, very interesting. We had 3 biological control options, 2 that became more effective, which was the Larra Wasp and the nematode, and you chose Larra Wasp to be one of your subjects of research. Tell me more about that part of the project, what you wanted to do with Larra, and what came out of that work.
Yeah, so the idea with the Larra Wasp, if everyone remembers, the Larra Wasp is a parasitoid that was introduced to control mole crickets from its native range in South America. And the idea with the wasp is that the wasp has been introduced. It's now widespread, essentially on the full range of the mole crickets in the United States. And something that came out in the research after the introduction of all these biocontrols was, okay, we have this wasp, but the wasp needs nectar to survive. You can think of them kind of like bees, right? They need to visit flowers as adults in order to survive. They need food just like us. And so there was this investigation of plants that you could plant to conserve the populations of the wasp. Essentially, the idea being you plant these flowers for the wasps then have a food source and then can do a better job controlling mole crickets in your pasture. And so that's really the more direct approach at mole cricket control that I took in my research, was investigating these nectar sources for the wasp and seeing what plants we might be able to use for this conservation biocontrol to provide nectar for the wasp on these people's pastures.
So the idea behind here was if we can have source of nectar, we can attract the Larra Wasp. The Larra Wasp controls the mole cricket.
Absolutely.
Simple as that.
And we need to do some more research on, if you plant these plants, how much control do you get? But what I saw from being out in the field looking at these wasps is that you get really high density of the wasps, assuming they have plants. I would go to field sites, and there would be hundreds of wasps flying around. They can be really dense, so long as they have flowers. But once the land manager came through and mowed the flowers or sprayed herbicide in the area or something like that, and the flowers disappear, you also see the wasps disappear. So again, you can have these really high biological density of the wasp, but they need those nectar sources, and you don't really see them without their nectar sources.
So it's one of those situations where, air quotes here, better pasture management, which would think about no weeds, can become a problem. Or another way to think is some of those weeds or other plants that are just undesirable there, from a pasture management perspective, can have a different function in IPM, integrated pest management.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely just a consideration. I'm not going to tell producers to go plant weeds on their pastures, obviously, and from my research, I found some better plants that I'm excited about anyway. But it's a good consideration for people to have is, if you want control of these mole crickets, the option we really have right now is biocontrol, but you need to allow the biocontrols to exist in that system if they're going to do the work of doing the control in your field.
And I think the interesting part is that the biological control there, you don't need to do anything other than allowing those plants to come. You don't need to implement any other management practice because the wasp is already there.
Yeah.
So we started this project with the assumption that permacosi was the nectar source for the wasp, and also with the knowledge that it can become a pretty bad invasive weed in your pasture. So we were looking for other options. How did you get to those results? So tell me a little bit more about the methods you used and what you found out about the work with the Larra.
Yeah, so the idea for my project with the Larra is we had, between me and Marcelo and some other researchers, we had tried to do some more planted field trials where we plant flowers for the wasp to test if they liked any of them. And that was really difficult because we had hurricanes ruin our field sites. We had drought ruin our field sites. We had all sorts of problems doing this work, and it just wasn't very productive. And so then I had this idea to come at it from a different perspective. Instead of planting flowers and seeing what the wasps like, let's figure out what the wasps are already feeding on out in the field sites. And to do this, I used genetic work where I would capture the wasps from my field sites and then freeze them and later do genetic work on them to identify the plants that were in their guts. And with some really powerful and amazing genetic techniques where you can identify all the different plant species that are present in the wasp digestive systems.
So basically we're desiccating, gutting those wasps, which are very tiny little creatures.
Yeah.
Desiccating them, getting that stomach content, and looking in what they're eating.
It was many hours of wasp dissections, rapidly trying to finish my master's research, yes. But I did do it. I had some amazing help from a lab, the Burgess lab at UF Entomology, to do this genetic work. It was a really successful project. I'm really happy with the results we got. We identified lots of different plants in the digestive tracts of the wasps.
That is fantastic. So what are the most interesting results that came out of that genetic work?
Well, I think the main highlight that's different from a lot of the previous research is we had buttonweed or Spermacosea verticillata really being the main recommendation in some of the older published literature. Kind of, you could read that as making it out to be that they only really like that plant or they're very selective. But from my work, even reading the old papers and doing this project, is that, they're picky, but they're not very specific. I identified 25 different families of plants that the wasps were feeding on, representing 44 genera, or to the genus level identification of plants in the digestive tracts of the wasps. So they'll feed on a lot of different things just from those numbers alone.
So the diet is way more diverse than what we previously thought.
Absolutely. They're at least willing to feed on a lot of these different plants. Now, how preferred those plants are is more into question, but from my results we can also kind of get at that with the amounts of DNA that we found in the digestive tracts.
Very interesting. And also, I think for me, one of the interesting aspects is that the Larra Wasp is in the environment. So it is surviving there for some reason. So it's already there. In terms of management, we just need to provide a better environment for them to be attractive for them, but they are surviving. So understanding how they're surviving that was the key.
That was one of the main questions. Is we had never actually described what the wasps were feeding on in the wild in North Florida or at the range in the rest of the United States, because Spermacosea is it's an invasive weed in South Florida, but it's not very widespread up north of here or further north into other states. And so we didn't even really know what the wasps were feeding on without us planting something for them, right? And so that was kind of one exciting result, is seeing what the wasps are already using and then picking some of these plants and seeing, okay, what might be good for us to test and then for producers to grow on their farms that would help with this problem.
And we devised some strategies. We didn't implement them, but we thought about some strategies of integrating that control with the regular pasture management.
Yeah. I mean, you really need the combination of everything, of the good pasture management, but I think the biocontrol can really help.
I think so. Wilhelm, we've done a lot of legwork from here, from when we started with those ideas until the point we are today, and you have identified several of the big gaps that were still need to be addressed. From here on, what would be the course of action that you suggest us taking with this research and with the work with our producers?
Well, the thing with the Larra Wasp that I see the obvious next steps being is taking some of my more exciting plants, and then someone does a research project, which would be fairly simple. I'm assuming no hurricanes come through and destroy the field plots, which is to plant some of these plants, evaluate the occurrence of the wasps on the plants, and seeing, how easy is it to grow the plants? How long will the wasps be on the plants? Are they feasible to use in the pasture? I think is really the question there. And then from that research, we could provide a recommendation that, okay, you can plant these plants and then you'll get some control of the mole crickets in the field, or at least you can maintain a population of the wasp.
Fantastic. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to integrate that management, because when we think about mole crickets, it's not a problem for pastures only. It's also a problem for turf and integrated in other areas. So I think as a community, we can benefit from those management. I've been thinking a lot of strategies on how we can create those areas for attraction. Do you have any thoughts about the status or the potential for the nematode moving forward?
I think the nematode definitely has a lot more potential for work. When I was looking at all the work on the nematode, there was a lot of gaps that I saw. One main gap is we don't really know exactly where the nematode has spread today. We can see the wasp is nice, right? Because the wasp is big, it lives out in the open, so people can photograph it, put it on iNaturalist, and you can see the full range of the wasp in the United States on iNaturalist. And the nematode is not the same because it's a tiny worm. No one really likes worms. and it's hard to know where exactly they are. We know it's pretty widespread in Florida. I wanted to look at the nematode occurrence at my producers' farms, but I wasn't able to get enough large mole crickets in order to do the nematode sampling.
So that is another gap on the mole cricket research in general that we could be looking at.
Yeah, I think the key here is that we know the biocontrol works, right? So when the nematode and the wasp were introduced, we saw this dramatic reduction in the populations of mole crickets. And so I think the main problem that people are facing is, we release these biocontrols, but it's not necessarily on everyone's farm. So I think that's part of the main issue with mole crickets today. And that's why we're really looking into, okay, how do you ensure that the biocontrols are on the farms? One way is to do this nectar meal stuff with the larvae. I think providing them nectar sources will be really helpful. And then if we were able to get the nematode back as a product, maybe as some sort of extension service or something like that, where we can then deliver it to producers again. There's a lot of producers that I talked to, they didn't know if they had nematodes or they never had nematodes applied to their farms. And so that could be an issue, as well as that, great, we have this biocontrol, but if it's not on your farm, then obviously you're living in conditions like back in the day when you would see thousands of mole crickets living, like crawling around on the sidewalk, right? So pre-biocontrol conditions.
That is a scary scene to think about, all those mole crickets crossing the sidewalk or the pastures here. It's a big problem. Fantastic. Any other message you want to leave?
The pest mole crickets are going to start flying now through May, and then they're going to start having their babies by late May and June. And that's where the problem starts all over again, right?
Sure.
So we have all these little mole crickets running around, growing big and fat and eating your grasses later in the year.
Yeah, and there is not much we can do at this point other than make sure that pasture conditions are good fertilization. You said we didn't see in this work any grazing management effect, but normally when I think about grazing management, overgrazing leads to pasture deterioration, pasture weaknesses, and then we see more of that. So I think it's just those are the simple management things that we can do at this point.
And I think the main issue with my work is that I would survey people like through a digital survey, and I would go to their farms, but each situation is quite different at each of these farms. And so to really get at this problem, again, I think we need to revisit the economic threshold for mole crickets. I think we as scientists can do a better job of hammering that down so we can actually go to someone's farm and really say, okay, this is a damaging level of mole crickets. Let's step up from here. Or you have mole crickets, but they're not in levels that would be damaging.
There is always more research to do. We evolve from the questions we ask. Wilhelm, I appreciate all your work in here, and it has been a pleasure working with you, and I wish you the best in the next steps of your career. I hope to keep in touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely, I will. So thank you for having me again.
Awesome. Thanks for listening to this podcast, and I hope you enjoy. Make sure to take 2 minutes to complete our survey. You can find a link in the description of this podcast. We want to hear from you, how you're using this information. Is it relevant for you? And more ideas for topics that can help you in the future. Looking forward to interacting more with you. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy, and I'll see you in our next Cow Talks podcast. This podcast was brought to you by the University of Florida Forage Team with technical support from the UF Cows Faculty Instructional Resource and Support Team. This episode was produced by Marcelo Valau, Olivia Mowley, and Ashley Kalabroski. I hope you have enjoyed this conversation. And if you have any feedback, please leave us a comment in our social media or send us an email to forages@ifas.ufl.edu. Until the next one,